So, with all that said, let's get going. So, the topic of this discussion is non-monogamy. We're going to explore it and rethink connections of different relationship structures and relationship rules. All right. So, a little bit about me. My name is Lena. Like I mentioned, I do a couple of things. I am a professor of philosophy at New Mexico State University in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I've taught at Ohio State, Grand Valley State, Texas Christian University, which wasn't the best fit for me in the long run, and elsewhere as well. I collaborate to help facilitate a dialectical behavior therapy program that's queer inclusive and neuro inclusive out of Pennsylvania. The program's called Grow Through Change. I am the founder of Transcendence Coaching, which is a coaching and consulting practice that is queer-centered, kink-informed, non-monogamy informed, and run as much as is practicable on anti-capitalist principles. So if you're ever interested in collaborating on that kind of work, or you need some support, you want to reach out, feel free to be in touch and we can set something up. I'm also a peer facilitator and an educator here at Plume, where I facilitate a 40-plus group for our members and also our neurodivergent group, and do regular events such as this one. Credentials, I have a PhD in philosophy, got that a long time ago. Certified as a sexuality counselor through the Sexual Health Alliance, where I used to be the plus curriculum coordinator. It's a certification granting group that trains sex therapists, relationship coaches, intimacy consultants, etc., etc. So I'm a graduate, and then they hired me to basically rewrite their program. And in terms of identity, the lenses through which I experience the world and through the world experiences me, I am a non-binary trans femme. I'm a trans woman existing outside the binary, is the way I usually like to put it. I am sapphically oriented, which means I'm attracted to, well, it's hard to say, but more on the side of things. So I am also aromantic and asexual, but still oriented in attraction of other sorts for the sapphic. In terms of my relationship practice, I am a relationship anarchist. And if you don't know what that means, I'll tell you in just a couple minutes. Maybe you are one too. Maybe not, and that's okay as well. I am a neurodivergent individual. I am autistic and I do have ADHD, though in my experience, it's neither a disorder nor is it a deficit of attention, though it is very much a disability. And finally, most fundamentally, I am white. So even though I am trans, even though I'm neurodivergent, even though I'm queer, I experience all of these things predominantly in their white manifestations. And I think that's important to note because it's going to be a presence in my perspectives. It's going to be a presence in my interactions, no matter what I do, and better to acknowledge it rather than pretend like it isn't there. So that's a little bit about who I am, what I'm like, what I've done, what I do, etc., etc. Now let's get into the agenda. Right? Now, I already see some questions coming in the Q&A, and I love that. And I'll say to them, we'll get into all that stuff. So let's get into it. I want to cover 5 main topics tonight. I want to cover this big concept of what's called mononormativity, and then look at non-monogamies. Not just non-monogamy, but non-monogamies, because there's more than one kind. Then I want to introduce some new concepts and terms. I'll say probably new for most of us. I suspect there'll be at least one new term for everyone in the space, but for some of y'all, this might be a review if you're more familiar with non-monogamy of various sorts. We'll spend a little bit of time talking about this question of whether or not relationship styles, whether monogamous or non-monogamous, are identities or practices. And then reflect a little bit on this process of embracing our own relationship style and sort of figuring out and exploring and accepting what works best for us. So that's the plan, and let's get to it. You've probably heard of heteronormativity, this idea that the default person is straight, the blueprint is heterosexual, and if we deviate from that blueprint, that's our problem. We are somehow defective, delusional, etc., etc. Perhaps you've heard of cisnormativity, which is this idea that being cisgender is the default, the blueprint, and if you deviate from that, that's your problem, and you are a problem. Well, those two things, cisnormativity, heteronormativity, and other things of the sort, they have a cousin called mononormativity. Right? So a norm is a rule. A norm is an expectation. Typically, they're socially constructed. They are the expectations that society places on us for how we can be, how we can experience ourselves, how the world is allowed to experience us, and how we're allowed to move. Right? Normativity of the mononormative sort is the social norm regarding what kinds of relationships are permissible and which ones are considered deviant or defective. So let's break it down. This is a quote by someone who, if you've come to any webinar for me ever, you've heard me quote Meg John Barker, because they're a huge influence on all that I think, all that I am, all that I do. This comes from their fantastic book, Rewriting the Rules, an anti-self-help guide to love, sex, and relationships. And I think the quote captures this observation of mononormativity pretty well. So Barker writes, mainstream self-help books about relationships generally assume that pairing up monogamously is natural and normal, and don't consider any models for romantic relationships other than the usually married couple. Barker continues, when I studied mainstream sex manuals, I was surprised that none of them even mentioned the possibility of people being openly non-monogamous, except very occasionally to claim that it can never work. And speaking autobiographically, when I was growing up, I never heard of non-monogamy. I never heard of monogamy either, because we didn't need a word for it. It was just what you did. And then when I first learned about non-monogamy, I learned about it in a negative critical context, as a mistake that people make that ruins their relationships, under the assumption that it can, as Barker says, never work. But to figure out really what mononormativity is, first let's center on the concept of monogamy and figure out what that really is at its heart too. Okay? So what is monogamy? It's a relationship structure in which an individual, like you or me, has or strives to have a single, no more, no less, one romantic and or sexual partner at a time. And those partnerships are characterized by exclusivity, romantic and sexual, and commitment, romantic and sexual. And they're often culturally or legally recognized as the normative standard, that is the prescription, the way things are done for long-term partnerships and family formation. So to say that, well, let's put it this way. What is monogamy in simplified terms? It's this idea that all of us should either be in or be seeking a relationship with one person, no more, no less, that is romantic and sexual, that is exclusive and committed. And then on top of that, that relationship structure is the norm, culturally and legally. Now, that first part, an individual having or striving to have a relationship with just one person, romantic and sexual, no more, no less, characterized by exclusivity and commitment, nothing wrong with that. If that's what you want, fantastic, right? Go for it. The criticism to come is not of monogamy, it's of mononormativity, or put in another term, compulsory monogamy, right? So compulsory monogamy or mononormativity, it's this assumption, conscious or unconscious, that all persons are by default monogamous, and that all other relationship structures are to some degree detrimental, deficient, defective, deviant, or delusional. Right? So think again about heteronormativity. There's nothing wrong with being straight, right? I tease my straight friends sometimes, but there's nothing wrong with being straight, right? I'm not better than them because I'm not straight, right? But there is a problem with the cultural centering of straightness as the only real way to be, right? My cisgender friends, nothing wrong with being cisgender. I love that for them. Good for them. Bless their heart, right? There's nothing wrong with being cisgender, but there is something wrong with centering cisgender identity as the only plausible identity and insisting that all others are less than, shameful, wrong, broken, right? So that's the difference here too. Nothing wrong with monogamy, but mononormativity, compulsive monogamy, that's a different story. But we absolutely live, just like we live in a heteronormative, cisnormative, patriarchal culture, we live in a mononormative culture. Right? I mean, I guess I can't say universally because I didn't see where absolutely everyone is from. But if you're in the US, you live in a mononormative culture because US culture is rife with compulsory monogamy. And this actually hurts us all, right? We're probably familiar with the arguments and observations that patriarchy harms men. And also that heteronormativity harms straight people and cisnormativity harms cis people. Well, whether you're monogamous, non-monogamous, or anything else, mononormativity is a potential harm for you too, right? Mononormativity even harms monogamous people. And it does so by replacing genuine choice, the choice to be monogamous, with rigid expectation to be monogamous. It replaces autonomy with enforced social scripts. And it also enforces conformity to those expectations and social scripts through shame and social pressure. Right? Under mononormativity, many folks are monogamous because they inherit it, because they have to be, not because it's the result of any kind of autonomous choice. Right? So, with that groundwork laid, I would like to ask the group, you can feel free to share your answers in the chat here. What representations, and I bet there have been few, of non-monogamy have you seen in popular culture and media? What have they been like? And what kind of messages do they send? Right? So I'm curious if any of you want to share what comes to mind when you think about pop culture and media, where you've seen non-monogamy and what has it been like? I can pause for a moment to give voice to any answers that come in. Okay, I can think of one non-monogamous relationship in a manga that I've read. Notice that, like, how particular that example is, which shows how rare it is, right? This one, reality TV, messy and cis. I love the example as of reality TV, like Too Hot to Handle, The Bachelor, Love Island, all these as examples of non-monogamy, right? I think that these things are that like reality dating shows are it's some of the queerest media out there. Like I watch Love Island and I'm like, I'm so affirmed in being who I am just by comparison, because I'm like, wow, this world is so absurd. The world depicted on the screen that I just feel so much better about myself, right? But think about what's going on a show like The Bachelor. What you have is a whole bunch of people dating a whole bunch of people at once. And it not being seen as really a problem, but it also being seen as a means to an end. So on a show like The Bachelor, it's always non-monogamy until you find your monogamous connection. But as a number of the rest of y'all are pointing out in there, that it's often depicted as wrong, as harmful, as unethical, right? There's this sort of cultural conflation of non-monogamy with cheating, right? And it's possible to be non-monogamous and cheat, but we'll get into that a little bit more in just a moment. So, moving on, let's distinguish some different kinds of non-monogamies because there's not just one way to do it. Non-monogamy just means that you're not monogamous, but there's a whole spectrum of practices, identities, however we want to conceive of them out there. I love this quote from Thich Nhat Hanh, who is another person who's been a big influence on me throughout my adult life. This is from his work, True Love, A Practice for Awakening the Heart. And he says in very clear language, in true love, you attain freedom. When you love, you bring freedom to the person you love. If the opposite is true, if you're not bringing freedom to them, it's not true love. You must love in such a way that the person you love feels free. Right? Now, that's going to hit different for different folks. Different folks are going to feel free with different kinds of love, right? And for some folks, it might be a monogamous connection that makes you feel free, right? But for other of us, it might be any of the following menu. So here we'll get into, I believe I have 9 different types of non-monogamies that I'll walk us through. Some of them are only subtly different, right? But we'll try to draw out the differences. The first is a word that is oftentimes run together with and taken as synonymous with non-monogamy, and that's polyamory, right? There's this idea somehow that if you're not monogamous, then you must be polyamorous. And if you're not polyamorous, then you must be monogamous. But no, If you're not monogamous, you're non-monogamous. And polyamory is one kind of non-monogamy. But what is it? Well, it means many loves, right? It's this idea of being open to the practice of engaging in multiple consensual, emotionally or romantically significant relationships at the same time with the knowledge and agreement of everyone involved, right? That last part is important. It's not cheating because this is consensual. This is above board. This is discussed. This is out in the open, right? You have the knowledge and agreement of everyone involved. And that's why sometimes polyamory is referred to as ethical non-monogamy or consensual non-monogamy. I personally bristle when I hear those terms because they sound unnecessarily defensive. You never hear people talking about consensual monogamy or ethical monogamy. So if they don't got to use it, we don't got to use it, right? We don't need to perpetuate this idea that the default non-monogamy is unethical, right? By using those qualifiers. But when we think of polyamory, think of it as multiple emotionally or romantically significant relationships at the same time. Now, monogamous people might have multiple consensual, emotionally or romantically significant relationships one at a time. They stack them over time. Maybe you date this person for 6 months, then you date this person for 5 months, you date this person for 2 years. The difference with polyamory is you're just doing them all at once and everyone knows about it. Right? Now, we can get even more fine-grained. There is a type of polyamory called polyfidelity. Right? And what polyfidelity is it's a form of polyamory in which all of the members are committed to being romantically and or sexually exclusive within a closed group with no outside relationships. So under the broader notion of polyamory, I might have a partner and that partner is free to date, right? I like to know about it for health reasons, also just because I care about what's going on in my partner's life. So we talk about our relationships. Polyfidelity is no, we are closed, right? So think about just like in a monogamous case where you have two people who are sexually and romantically exclusive. Polyfidelity is a lot like that, just with more people. This is where you might have a triad or a square or an N shape, or I guess an N shape wouldn't typically work here, but where it's closed. You're not looking for more, and there's an expectation that no one is going to start dating anyone outside of the current partnerships, right? So there's non-monogamy. One kind of it is polyamory. One kind of polyamory is polyfidelity. Here's another kind of polyamory. This is one is very influential in my own practice. It's called solo polyamory. And sometimes people talk about solo polyamory as if it's just the same as being single. That's not right, right? It's a form of polyamory in which a person is open to engaging in multiple consensual relationships, but without seeking to couple, right? Cohabitating, entwining finances, etc., and instead prioritize autonomy and independence, right? So I might have a partner who's my partner, but we're not a couple. We're deeply invested in one another. We negotiate and consent to the way we're doing our relationship, but we're not following this typical pattern of escalation where we meet and then we go through these milestones. We're expected to move in together, get married, share a bank account. We don't really have an interest in getting enmeshed or entwined in that way. Instead, we're both kind of solo, but we're partners. Right? Now, that can be hard to wrap your mind around, but the more time you spend in polyamory world and in non-monogamy world, the more it starts to become intuitive, right? So let's look at some other kinds of non-monogamies that take us outside of polyamory. Here's a term coined by relationship expert Dan Savage, monogamish, right? And this is kind of what's going on, I think, in a lot of the reality dating shows, right? They're not polyamorous on The Bachelor. They're monogamish on The Bachelor. And to be monogamish is to be in a relationship or to want a relationship that is primarily monogamous, but allows for occasional consensual sexual activity outside the partnership, typically with clear boundaries and mutual understanding. right? So maybe you have rules, like you have a particular kink that your partner's not into. So even though you're by and large monogamous, there's an exception. Maybe you get to enjoy this one experience, kind of experience with someone else, right? Or maybe you suspend rules when one of you is traveling or something like that. Think of this as like monogamy with porous boundaries, but it's not cheating because there is clear communication about it. No secrets, right? That's monogamish. Once you start to make that a little bit more porous, you start to have the exceptions be a little bit more routine, then you get into the realm of what's called an open relationship. Right? Again, a lot of times people use open relationship and polyamory as synonymous. They're not. They're very different things, right? I am personally much more comfortable in my own practice with polyamory than I am with an open relationship. What's an open relationship? It's a consensual arrangement in which committed partners agree that one or both, or all, depending on how many are there, may engage in romantic or sexual relationships with others outside the primary relationship. Right? So there's a primary relationship that's like the centerpiece of the open relationship, but all involved or one involved or however many involved are allowed to have side encounters. Right? So what's the difference between being in an open relationship and being monogamish? Basically, it's a difference of degree, right? If the outside encounters are conditional, infrequent, if they're the exception, monogamish. If they're more frequent, if they're to be expected, if they're a routine part of the practice, open relationship. And both of these can be compared and contrasted with this notion of swinging, right? Which has a whole subculture around it. A friend of mine recently bought a trucker hat with a pineapple on it, and I had to inform her that she's going to get a lot of attention now when she goes out wearing that hat because the pineapple is a symbol of the swinger community. So, the more you know. But swinging involves a consensual arrangement and subcultural practice in which committed partners engage in sexual activity with others, typically in a social or recreational context, often without emotional involvement. So, a sort of no strings attached practice of swapping partners or going out to a swingers club where the expectation is that you and your partner are going to have sexual contact with other people in the space. Right? So, you might be a swinger in an open relationship. You might be in an open relationship and be a swinger. You might be one or not the other. Right? This is all modular, all variable. Just a few more, and then we'll move on into the rest of our topics. I mentioned relationship anarchy at the very beginning. So a lot of our ideas about relationships come from authority, from this top-down imposition of expectations of how a relationship can or should be. The relationship anarchist rejects that top-down authority and says, no, I will build my own relationship structure. So this is not so much a practice as it is a philosophy of relationships that rejects hierarchy, typically rejects conventional labels and social norms around relationships, instead emphasizing autonomy, consent, and the freedom to shape each connection based on the needs and desires of those involved. So here's what that might look like in practice. Suppose I'm a relationship anarchist. I'm in a relationship with like everyone in my life, right? Relationships are frequent, they are common. I'm in a relationship with the person who delivers my mail. I'm in a relationship with the person who makes my coffee at the coffee shop. I'm in a relationship with the person with whom I share a bed, right? It's just with each of these, we tailor and customize what that relationship can be based on what it kind of wants to be between us, right? So we get to fully customize every relationship, right? Maybe some it's best if we stay as a platonic connection. Maybe with others, there's a romantic connection. Maybe with others, there's a sexual connection. But one thing relationship anarchists will reject is putting these in any kind of hierarchy. They're going to reject the idea that romantic partners have some kind of primacy that platonic partners lack, right? Or they're going to reject the idea that having a sexual partner is somehow more important than having a creative partner, et cetera, et cetera. Right? So, okay, two more to talk about. And these next two I think are really interesting and don't get talked about enough in these contexts. But ambyamory, right? Like if you're ambidextrous, you can use both hands. If you're ambiamorous, then you're open to both monogamy and non-monogamy. It's an openness to and capacity to enjoy and be fulfilled by either monogamous or polyamorous relationships, but without a strong preference for one over the other. Right? So it's kind of like you could go either way, depending on circumstances, depending on the wants or needs of yourself at the time or of your partner at the time. Right? Now, I still think of ambyamory as a kind of non-monogamy because it's open to polyamory, right? And being polyamorous just means that you're open to being polyamorous. You don't actually have to have multiple partners. It's more of a disposition or an outlook than it is a checklist of how many partners you have. So I think, like technically speaking, ambyamory is a form of non-monogamy. It's just one that sometimes involves the actual practice of non-monogamy, and sometimes involves the practice of monogamy. And then the one that I've actually only ever seen one other person talk about is intentional singledom. Some of us don't date. Some of us make a conscious choice to remain single as a way to prioritize autonomy, personal growth, non-romantic relationships, rather than seeking romantic or sexual partnership. And I will argue that this is actually a form of non-monogamy. Why? Because non-monogamy says that, roll back. Monogamy says that we should all either be in or be seeking romantic, sexual, exclusive, committed connections with at most and at least one person, right? So monogamy prescribes partnership. So if you reject partnership and choose to remain intentionally single, then you're kind of on the opposite side of monogamy than polyamory and all those. It's not that you have more than one partner, it's that you have less than one. Monogamy says one. The other forms of non-monogamy say more, singledom says less, right? So this is not to say that all single people are non-monogamous, but if you are choosing to be single, there is a sense in which you're practicing non-monogamy. So I'd like to ask again to the chat, which of these styles of non-monogamy are familiar to you? Which are newer to you? And which, if any, whether you actually are going to or want to practice them at all, which are more appealing to you? Are there any that you saw that you're like, I never heard of that before? Or one that you saw that you're like, actually, that sounds kind of neat. See, someone mentioning polyfidelity, I just didn't know there was a specific name for it. Yep. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, it's once you start getting into the community, there are names for everything. There's so much. I see this question, polyfidelity is basically a polycule, right? Not exactly. I'll talk about polycules in just a minute. Polyfidelity will involve a polycule, but not all polycules are polyfidelis. Fidelitas. Yeah, but more on that in just a minute. I think it's coming up in like 2 slides. I see one person mentioning monogamish is new. It is a newer term. It was coined only in the last couple of years. See one person talking about RA being most aligned. Some folks saying polyfidelity seems to be the one that appeals the most. One shout out to ambyamory. Cool. Yeah, and I myself waffle between these. I never know because, labels are slippery. Am I ambiamorous? Am I relationship anarchist? Am I solo polyamorous? Am I intentionally single? It's which label fits you the best and helps you make most sense of your own story. I see this question. Is it possible to be open to being non-monogamous or monogamous, but only one type of non-monogamy? Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, you might be ambiamorous, but then the only non-monogamy you'd consider is something like polyfidelity, right? I see this comment. I practice relationship anarchy. The stratification of friends and partners is upsetting, so I don't recognize either wholly on their own. I feel you on that, friend. Like, my friends, my partners, like, this is a continuum. It's not like one gets priority over the other. Friends are important relationships, right? And an interesting thing about relationship anarchy that I'll note before we go to the next slide is it can look like anything. Someone who is a relationship anarchist might be in a relationship that on the surface looks exactly like monogamy, but if it's customized, if it's sort of built through that anarchic approach rather than following a script, it plausibly could be considered a kind of relationship anarchy. I'll take a couple questions from the Q&A box and then move on to the next. So I see this question about, just reading over it. Ooh, there's a question about ethical way to find a new partner when you're in a sort of relationship dyad. So two people wanting to bring in another and not be a unicorn hunter. So that's a term that I'll introduce to anyone who doesn't know it. So a unicorn is a third that you bring in basically as to fulfill a desire or fantasy for the two, right? So there's me and my partner, and we want to mix it up. So we invite a third in, but really that third is more of a conscious sex toy than they are a full participant in the relationship. That person is a unicorn, and we, if we're looking for that, is we are unicorn hunters. Now, the question in the Q&A box asked, how can we go about this in an ethical way and not be unicorn hunters? I actually think, and some of y'all might disagree with this, I don't think unicorn hunting is essentially unethical if you're open about it and everyone's informed. So some people want to be unicorns, and if you're aligned on that, fine, totally cool. But that's, I think, what you need to do. If you're looking for a unicorn, be open that you're looking for a unicorn. And if you're looking for a genuine third to bring in, be open about that too. And when you do that, negotiate. As a third, are you dating me and them, or are you dating us? Are we dating each other? Is like, are A, B, and C all dating, or is A dating B and C, and B dating A and C dating A and B, etc.? Like, how does that work? If you have those questions openly, honestly, and think about the power dynamics and stuff involved, because the established couple is going to have more privilege in the connection than the third brought in. If you're having those discussions, I think those are your steps toward doing it ethically. Cool. Cool. So I'll loop in some more questions as we go, but we'll continue on with the material. Want to give you some new concepts and terms. And here I always think of that song from Aladdin. Princess Jasmine sings, a whole new world, a dazzling place I never knew. But when I'm way up here, it's crystal clear that now I'm in a whole new world with you. Getting into non-monogamy can feel like that, right? So let's get a map of the landscape through some of the language. Someone in the chat asked a minute ago about a polycule. And you can think of a polycule as just a network of people connected through non-monogamous relationships. Not just polyamorous relationships, but really any kind, right? So I might be in a sort of anarchic relationship with this person, and they're in a sort of polyamorous relationship with this person who's in a monogamous relationship with this person. When you map that all out, the structure you get is a polycule. It's a play on poly and molecule, right? And there are websites you can go to with tools to actually map out your polycule, and it's really fun to do, actually, see the structures, etc. Now, within a polycule, not everyone in a polycule is your partner all the time, right? You might be in like a V, where this person is dating this person and this person, but these two are not dating each other. What are they? They're not partners, but we call them metamors. So a metamor is the partner of your partner in a non-monogamous relationship. Someone you're connected to indirectly, but with whom you don't have a direct romantic or sexual relationship. So I have a partner in LA. My partner in LA has a partner. I'm not partners with that partner. We're metamors. We have a different kind of relationship. And metamor relationships can look really different in different situations. We'll talk about that in a minute. One thing that people worry about when they're getting into non-monogamy is jealousy, right? And that's a legit worry. It's not unique to non-monogamy. There's a lot of jealousy that shows up in monogamy. And if I may, when we think about what the difference is between jealousy and envy, it has to do with loss versus missing out. Jealousy is when you're afraid you'll lose something. Envy is when you want something that someone else has. Now, in monogamy, jealousy might show up as you being worried that your partner is going to leave you for someone else. You get jealous because you see that person as a threat to your relationship. In non-monogamy, where multiple connections are normalized, it's actually less likely that your partner will leave you for someone else because they're just typically allowed to go date that person, right? So, conceived of this way, monogamy is actually a much more fertile ground for jealousy than non-monogamy, right? People are going to experience things differently, but that's one lens through which to look at it. But oftentimes contrasted with jealousy is this other emotion that rarely gets talked about outside of non-monogamous discussions, and even my word processor still doesn't recognize it as a word: compersion. And what this is it's a feeling of joy or happiness that you experience when you see your partners happy or fulfilled in other relationships. So my partner in LA just went on a road trip with their partner who's out there with them, and they had a great time. They loved it. They camped, they like saw beautiful sights, they took cute pictures, and I love that for them. I want to hear all about it. I want to see the pictures. Like, this person who is my partner is happy, and I'm happy that they're happy. I'm not jealous that I wasn't there. I'm glad that they had that experience. That's the feeling of compersion, right? And not everyone feels it, and you don't need to feel it. It's okay to struggle with jealousy, right? But if you can tap into compersion, it can be really fulfilling. A few more terms, and then we'll keep going. So, in a lot of different kinds of monogamy, you see different distinctions, different designations for different kind of partners. Some people will talk about primary partners, right? Think back to when you're monogamish or in an open relationship or you're a swinger, right? Your primary partner is the person with whom you have the most significant, committed, and prioritized romantic and or logistical relationship within a non-monogamous structure. So I might have a partner who in my polycule is given primary status, and then I have a whole bunch of secondary or tertiary partners, right? Creates a hierarchy where some partners are prioritized over others. Now, there's a lot of discourse in non-monogamous community about whether or not having primary partners is okay. I tend to think it's okay if everyone is informed and consenting, right? But it does come with risk of power imbalances, et cetera, right? Now, a different kind of partner is your nesting partner. This is a partner with whom you share a home or a living space, often indicating like a deeper level of domestic commitment within their relationship network. Now, in a lot of mononormative frameworks, your primary partner is supposed to be your nesting partner. But in a non-monogamous framework, you might have one, you might have neither, you might not want either, you might want only one, not the other. One person might be both, or two people might play these roles. Your primary partner might live in another city, but then you have a nesting partner who's a secondary partner, right? And both of those can be contrasted with what's called an anchor partner, right? So an anchor partner is your anchor. They're a trusted, steady partner who provides emotional stability and support, often serving as a central or grounding figure within a network of relationships. Again, in a mononormative framework, your primary partner is your nesting partner, is your anchor partner. Non-monogamy gets more modular. My partner in LA is my anchor partner, but we live 10 hours apart. We're not nesting partners, and I don't have a primary partner. Their nesting partner is their primary partner. So there's an asymmetry. They practice hierarchy. I don't. We've talked it through. We're both on board with the way it works out, right? But then their case, their primary partner and nesting partner is not their anchor partner. I'm their anchor partner, right? So this might sound like a lot of jargon, especially if it's new, but the beauty of it is that these things come apart, right? Gives us a lot more room to play, to explore, to grow. Now, I think I got two more slides of concepts and terms, then we'll continue. Some non-monogamy is considered what's called kitchen table. And just picture a bunch of people sitting around a kitchen table, talking to each other, playing cards, having drinks, whatever. This is a style of non-monogamous relationship dynamic where all or most partners and metamorphs feel comfortable interacting together casually, often literally sitting around the same kitchen table, maybe playing Dungeons and Dragons, right? Promoting openness, cooperation, and mutual communal connection, right? There's a joke in the community that the reason people become polyamorous is just to find D&D groups because there's such an overlap in the community. So real. But kitchen table is just where partners and metamors hang out. This is in contrast to what sometimes gets called parallel poly, which is where partners and metamors know about each other, but they maintain separate social circles and interactions, and they don't regularly mingle or form a close-knit communal group. So the relationships they don't intersect, they run parallel. This is also sometimes called garden party, where even though they run in parallel, maybe infrequently, they don't gather at a kitchen table, but they have an event where they all get together. But it's not like a weekly thing, it's maybe a yearly thing, right? And then a third kind, and a lot of people will tell you, and I think rightly so, that there are some red flags if this one is insisted on, is what's called don't ask, don't tell. This is an arrangement where partners agree to not share details about their other romantic or sexual activities, maintaining boundaries of privacy to avoid discomfort or jealousy. Right? And the reason I'll say this is a little bit of a red flag is when you avoid discomfort or jealousy, it doesn't go away. It just gets pushed down and pressurized. Better to confront and process things like discomfort and jealousy if you can. And also, if you're not sharing details, it's a lot easier to be dishonest. It's a lot easier to transmit STIs because there's not open disclosure about what kind of sexual activities are going on. There's a lot more room for speculation, and it's just harder to trust. So I would think long and hard before opting into don't ask, don't tell. I won't tell you not to do it, but think it over and definitely have some hard conversations with potential partners if they insist on it. And now the last set of terms before we continue on. In some polycules, in some different relationship structures, there's what's called veto power. This is the authority that one partner or more has to reject or forbid certain actions by their partner in other relationships, often to protect emotional boundaries or maintain safety. So if I'm in a relationship with someone, they might have veto power where I want to start dating someone new, they can say no. They can be like, I'm not okay with that, right? Now, whether or not anyone in a polycule has veto power is something the polycule wants to talk about and think about very carefully because just like before, it can turn into red flags. It can be very tricky, right? And there's also good conceptual questions to ask about what's the difference between a veto and a boundary, right? So before, I have broken up with someone because of their metamor, because I didn't want to be connected with someone who still supported this metamor, who was a deeply violent person, right? So the fact that this person who I was dating would not end that dynamic was a deal breaker for me, right? But that wasn't me trying to control them through veto. That was me opting out myself, making a choice in reaction to their choice, right? Not compromising their autonomy, but acting in accordance with their choices, right? A term that I think all non-monogamous people should think more about is this next one on the screen, polysaturation. This is the feeling of having reached a personal limit for how many intimate or romantic relationships you can effectively maintain at a time without feeling overwhelmed or depleted. Right? Some people are partner collectors, especially if they're very new to non-monogamy. They want to date everybody. That's not possible. Time is a pie, right? If you give, like, love isn't a pie, but time is a pie, right? In the sense that if this person gets a slice, that limits the amount that can go to all the other people and to yourself, right? So you might be polyamorous, but have a polysaturation point of 2, where any more than that, and you can't, like you're out of energy. I actually think that you can be non-monogamous, polyamorous even, with a polysaturation point of 1, where having more than one partner exhausts you, but due to the framework in which you're having that one relationship, it still isn't monogamous. It's one partner, but it's non-monogamous with a polysaturation point of 1. That's, I think, possible. So I see this mentioned in the chat that relationships are definitely complicated. They are. They are. This is why Google Calendar is my favorite web-based tool in existence. Necessary. And then the last term that we'll mention here, and this is again bringing out these complications, is a term that's often called NRE. It's short for new relationship energy. And if you've ever been in a non-monogamous dynamic, you might have encountered this. Even if you've been in a monogamous dynamic, you've probably encountered this. It's the initial intense excitement, passion, euphoria that you might feel at the beginning of a new romantic or sexual relationship. Oftentimes it ends up being kind of like limerence, right? Now, new relationship energy is great. It feels amazing, but it's risky because it feels amazing. So sometimes when you're in a non-monogamous relationship and you meet someone new, the amount of NRE leads to you forgetting about, deprioritizing, ignoring your current partner, your established partner, right? And you want to talk about how you're going to manage that. Also, NRE can be habit forming to the point where you want it. And as soon as one person doesn't give you that NRE feeling anymore, you got to go find someone new. So now you're not looking for relationships, you're looking for new relationship energy, right? And that's an important thing to think about. Right. I see in the chat this observation that the difference between veto power and I'm breaking up because of your new partner seems blurry. It is blurry. And I think the real difference there is in terms of intention. One is an intention to control the other person. That's veto power. The other one is an exercise of your own agency, right? This person, I didn't say you can't date that person, right? That would be veto power, saying, no, you can't date that person. But I can say, I'm not willing to be metamors with someone who's dating that person, right? And that's a decision for me, not making a decision for someone else, right? So some reflection questions. We talked about conversion, talked about NRE. Have any of y'all felt those? And what have they been like for you? Feel free to type in the chat. Uh-huh. Definitely felt NRE, definitely like limerence. Like, yep, mm-hmm. Yeah, limerence is it's tricky and it's very easy to confuse for, true love, whatever that means. And while more answers are coming in, I'll look at some of the questions in the Q&A box. So I see this question. I realize that they're separate things, but could someone who is a relationship anarchist who does not know the term believe they are demisexual because they are not heard? I've been lost in terms because I feel I need that emotional connection, but I also have a high sex drive at time. Yeah, so I think so. I mean, it might be that you are there like a relationship anarchist and also demisexual, right? And it's yeah, very easy to get lost in this stuff. Rereading that last bit of the question. Yeah, like feeling that you need that emotional connection, but also having a very high sex drive, that's a human experience, right? Being demisexual and also having a lot of sexual desire, even if it's conditional sexual attraction, that is a possibility. And relationship anarchy can be a good fit for someone with that experience because that experience is going to get sort of deprioritized or stigmatized under mononormativity. And relationship anarchy would give you the ability to customize your relationships based on your actual experiences, what you can offer, what you want your partners to be able to offer. I see another question here. Would you say that having a more fluid differentiation between platonic and romantic relationships and allowing them to unfold is relationship anarchy? I think that's a part of it because the whole distinction between platonic and romantic is a binary. And as we know, binaries are misleading and oftentimes not really binaries. They're spectral is the word I want. A lot of my relationships exist between the romantic and the platonic in the realm of what gets called the queer platonic, right? Because it queers the platonic, right? Calls into question that binary. And I think relationship anarchy can be a great framework for embracing those queer platonic connections. But at the same time, I have friends who are romantically and sexually monogamous, but are queer platonically non-monogamous. So they have multiple relationships that are between the platonic and the romantic in that sort of middle ground. But then they also have a monogamous connection for the fully romantic and sexual component, right? So it's also interesting to note that for different kinds of partners, you might be monogamous in some areas and non-monogamous in others. I think a lot more people end up being non-monogamous than they think. Arguably, if you have a work wife, or if you have someone who's like a brother to you, or any of these things, These are different cultural ways of trying to describe these relationships that are somewhere between the platonic and the romantic. And yeah, you're starting to get into the realm of non-monogamy. Right? So in the interest of time, I'm going to continue on. Want to leave some time for Q&A at the end. Want to briefly consider this question of whether or not non-monogamy, monogamy, relationship structures in general are identities or practices. So Justin Clardy, who wrote this book called Why It's Okay to Not Be Monogamous, I wrote a review of it for a journal a few years ago. Just asks, like, points out some people ask whether monogamy and non-monogamies are identities or practices. And the question is, are people simply born that way, right? Just like some people say about queer folks, I don't like the sentiment, the born that way sentiment doesn't resonate with me. I think it doesn't do the work we want it to do. I think the way that I am is fine, whether I was born this way or not. I don't need that as like a defense, right? But is monogamy, non-monogamy, any of these things, are these ways that we are, or are they things that we do? That's the question. So whether relationship styles reflect orientations and hence identities or practices, widely debated topic. And even if we point out that we tend to adopt the relationship style that correlates with our values, we can ask, do our values shape the relationship style? Or does our inclination towards certain relationship styles shape our values? Right? So it's really hard to settle this. Right? A related question that comes up is whether or not non-monogamy is essentially queer. Right? And there's a lot of resistance to that, to the idea that if you're non-monogamous, then you're queer, right? But there is a case to be made. I'm not sure how much I buy it, but there is a case we can entertain that it is essentially queer. So non-monogamy is part of the broader landscape of gender, sexuality, and relationship diversities. Right? And some have argued that GSRD, gender, sexuality, and relationship diversity, is actually a better acronym than the growing LGBTQIA+ for various cultural, political, etc. reasons. Right? But non-monogamy is very much part of that kind of diversity of gender, sexuality, and relationships. And that diversity, right, even acknowledging it or legitimizing it is forbidden under the oppression of cis heteropatriarchy, right? So just like the cis heteropatriarchy doesn't like, gay people, doesn't like trans people, tends to not like non-monogamous people either, because they're not following the cultural script. We all push back on it in different ways, but we're all pushing back on the same script, right? So if you think that, as it says in the chat here, that it's rejecting these kinds of normative pressures, then it starts to sound pretty queer. I'll also point out my mug. I don't know if you can read it. It says, I've got 99 problems, and white heteronormative patriarchy is basically all of them. It's my favorite mug. This all said, there is some reason that we might want to rally around the identity that non-monogamy is an identity or even a queer identity. And that's just for legal reasons. Whether it is essentially queer or not, whether it's an identity or a practice, there's something to be gained by casting it as an identity rather than a practice. And that is the potential for legal recognition and protections against bias and discrimination. It's a lot easier to get identities legally protected from discrimination and bias than it is to get practices. Because practices, they're choices. You don't have to do it, but identities work differently, right? So whether we think philosophically that relationship structures correlate with identities or practices, there's some prudential reasons for going the identity, the orientation route, just for legal advocacy. So we could start to get multiple partnerships legally recognized. I mean, I don't know about you all, but I can't list all my partners on Facebook. I have to pick one. It enforces monogamy. Not that I use Facebook, but you know what I mean. So I'm curious if anyone just wants to answer real quick in the chat, does your own relationship style, whether monogamous or non-monogamous, feel more like an identity or like a practice for you? And this goes to, like I said, whether you are monogamous or non-monogamous. I see one person saying feels like an identity. And as I wait for more answers to come in, there's another question in the Q&A box. Are these slides available somewhere so we can review later? You'll get a follow-up email that will have them. They'll have a recording of all of this for you. So you'll definitely get that. And while we're waiting for some more answers to this question, I'll also share, for me, it kind of feels like both. It feels like a practice that is so aligned with my values and core that it becomes an identity. It's a practice that I identify with. So I kind of feel like it's a little bit of both. I am also a Buddhist, so I don't think that the notion of identity actually makes a lot of sense in the long run. I think it's a lot of it is just practices we very much identify with. But yeah, I'm seeing a lot of stuff about feels like identity, feels like identity. So an identity and a practice, view voices there. Cool. All right. So one last little section, then we'll move toward wrapping up. This is for folks who are newer to this whole range of concepts, this landscape. So if you ever read Andy Nordgren's The Short Instructional Manifesto for Relationship Anarchy, which you can find online, I fully recommend reading it no matter what relationship style you practice. One of the key ideas is this notion of customizing your commitments. Build the relationship structure that you want and that works for you. Explore, because those two things might not initially line up, but find something that on weight satisfies both. You want it and it works to the best degree. Maybe your customized commitments look like monogamy. That's great. You're doing it in a non-mononormative way because you're building it rather than doing it because you have to, because you're expected to, right? Sort of like my cis friends who reflect on their gender, think about their gender, right? And come to the conclusion that they are in fact cisgender. I love it when that happens, right? Because now they're cisgender reflectively, right? So, same here. Think about your commitments. Let yourself customize them. Maybe you end up with the same relationship structure you already have, but maybe you end up with something very different. The biggest obstacle to any intentionally chosen relationship structure is internalized mononormativity, right? Just like internalized queerphobia, internalized transphobia is a huge obstacle for many of us. This inner voice that shames us for even considering anything other than monogamy, that's harmful because it makes even monogamy itself a requirement rather than something we even could opt into. It takes away choice. So when you start to feel that internalized mononormativity, notice it, name it, set it aside over and over if you have to. And then try to find freedom or build freedom, gift yourself freedom to explore. Now, earlier when we looked at examples in media of non-monogamy, there's not a lot. And the ones that are out there typically aren't very good. Why? Because they're written by monogamous people for monogamous people. And if you've ever seen a movie about trans people written by cis people for cis people, you know that that doesn't work, right? But given the lack of any real readily available model of scripts for non-monogamous relationships, it's crucial that we give ourselves the freedom to explore. And that is going to in turn require giving ourselves permission to endure discomfort and error. You're not going to get it right the first time. You're going to get mistakes. Mistakes are mistakes, but mistakes are also okay. That's not like a get out of jail free card, right? Mistakes are human. We will make them. We take accountability for them, right? We don't just like let them slide off because, oh, it's human, right? But we should expect to make them. And not talk ourselves out of exploration because we are worried that we might get it wrong. You will. You will, right? It's kind of like when I first tried to do makeup, discomfort and error, right? But I had to go through that in order to learn how to do it, which I still haven't done because makeup is hard. And in addition to the finding freedom to explore, you also want to find freedom to change, right? I don't know about you all, but my transition journey has been complex. I was on the he, him, to he, they, them, to they, they, to she, her, back to she, they, to she, it, she, to she, they pipeline. Who knows where I'm going to be next year, right? And I'm kind of excited to find out because we are dynamic people. I don't want to be stagnant. My transition is lifelong. I like that about it. I don't want it to stop, right? I blossomed into a butterfly. I want to see what a butterfly turns into next, right? So applying that to non-monogamy, even when we find our style, we need to remember that we will still grow and change. And that might mean that the relationship style that best suits us might grow and change alongside us. We might practice relationship anarchy for a bunch of years and then choose monogamy. Or we might choose monogamy and then one day wake up and be like, you know what, I actually want to be a swinger. And then 2 years later, be like, I actually want to practice polyfidelity. That's all okay, right? Relationship styles don't need to be lifelong commitments, right? And change too often is seen as shameful. But seeing change in relationship style as shameful, I think, is indirect mononormativity, telling us, hey, all this exploration, no, no, just come back to monogamy. Just come back to monogamy and stay there. Oh, yeah, you tried polyamory and it didn't work. Told you it wouldn't work, right? This is a way that sort of policing through shame shows up, right? Yeah. So change need not be shameful. So I'm curious, thinking about ideal circumstances, right? What relationship style do you think you would find yourself most attracted to? And more interestingly, why? Right? Feel free to answer in the chat if you'd like. Me personally, I already said, I'm very attracted to relationship anarchy because I'm an anarchist, right? Got it tattooed on my palm. And I like the idea of building relationships based on the world that we actually live in with the people who are actually around me in a way that actually serves us, right? I'm also attracted to solo polyamory because I'm a very particular person. I don't really like to enmesh. I don't really like to have anyone in my personal space for too long. This is why I tend to prefer long distance partnerships. So, yeah, I tend to think of myself as being a relationship anarchist informed by solo polyamory, right? What about you all? Which of these, maybe one you learned for the first time today, if you're newer, in ideal circumstances, do you think you would be most attracted to? Hmm. See one nod toward relationship anarchy. Oh, I love this answer. I want a lesbian couple to adopt me and my partner. That sounds so nice. That sounds wonderful, actually. Yeah. Oh, more answers. Polyfidelity, kitchen style polyamorous. Another relationship anarchy, polyfidelity, close throuple. Yeah, and notice just the different answers we're getting in the chat here. There's a lot of representation of polyfidelity and a lot of representation of relationship anarchy that I'm noticing. I love the phrasing in this one comment in the chat, relationship anarchy in theory. And yeah, one thing you can note is that you can be a relationship anarchist in theory, and then in practice, it can look like any of these other styles, right? So you might be a relationship anarchist in theorist who's polyamorous in practice. It's just it has to do with the philosophy behind it, right? So just to recap where we've been, we talked about some mononormativity, introduced a whole menu of non-monogamies, and there are more out there. Got a whole lexicon of new concepts and terms. Thought a little bit about this idea of identity or practice and thought about sort of embracing your style. Right? Here's some recommended readings. You can feel free to screenshot that if you want. I mentioned the book by Meg John Parker. Fantastic. I recommend anything they write. At the bottom is Andy Nordgren's The Short Instructional Manifesto for Relationship Anarchy. Fascinating piece. And in the middle, there are two books by Jessica Fern, Polysecure and Polywise. If you're interested in how non-monogamies would intersect with attachment theory, definitely check it out. Because whether you are a dismissive avoidant, or you're anxious preoccupied, or if you're a disorganized attacher, or if you're somehow made it through life with a secure attachment style, good job. Those books will help you figure out how to navigate those and especially a mix of those in a non-monogamous context. I put this collection, Multiamory, Essential Tools for Model Relationships. It was written by the host of the Multiamory podcast, which is another resource that I would recommend. And then a shout out to my friend Laura Boyle, who runs the Ready for Polyamory Instagram account, which is a great resource. Her book came out last year called Monogamy in This Economy, Finances, Child Rearing, and Other Practical Concerns for Polyamory. So if you're interested in the financial side, the parenting side, that's a really great book to take a look at. Coming up, we've got some more events I'll put on your radar.